Ben kendim nasıl çalışabilirim daha sürdürülebilir bir gelecek için?
Paris Jolobajukti.
Mikä on pienenevän mehiläispopulaation vaikutus
Waarom
maapallon
zouden we om
ekosysteemiin?
klimaatverandering moeten geven?
循環型社会ってどういう
Quel
仕組み
est pied? Manger du soja non durable ou manger
Plastic
du
straws,
viande
whole
locale?
bag, pavitaan nokarime, parisirita kotaram balap.
هل لأفعالنا البسيطة قيمة؟
जब बर्फानी तोदे सब पिघल जाएंगे तो बर्फानी रीछों का
Welche
क्या
Art von
मस्तक
Auswirkungen
होगा?
hat Palmöl?
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to 4,600 Kilometers of Sustainability, a podcast where we, Sonja and Misha, bring sustainability information to you in an easily digestible and hopefully entertaining form as we hang out together, but 4,600 kilometers away from each other.
This is a sequel for our biodiversity episode, but you do not necessarily need to listen to the first part to understand this one.
But we will be really happy if you do listen to it regardless. Anyway, in this episode, we discuss polar bears and bees because you guys asked about those, and then we will talk about whales because we want to talk about whales.
One person asked us, how does the ever-decreasing honeybee population affect the Earth's ecosystem? This is a very interesting question and also a really important topic to discuss and hopefully do something about.
Furthermore, the issue is actually much more complicated than it seems at first glance. Namely, the statement about the ever-decreasing honeybee population is not necessarily even exactly true, in contrast to what people think.
In fact, it seems like the honeybee population is pretty stable or even increasing, at least if you talk about the non-wild populations. We will link some information from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations and from the United States Department of Agriculture if you want to learn more about this.
That is unbelievable.
But Sonja, does this now mean that there's nothing to worry about? Can we now move on to the polar bears?
No, not so fast, honey. There are actually plenty of other pollinators that are in trouble. These also include other bee species that are not the honeybee.
Just to back up a little, what is pollination again?
So because I'm a little bit busy right now, I will quote the Cambridge Dictionary for you. So pollination is, quote, the process in which pollen is taken from one plant or part of a plant to another so that new plant seeds can be produced, unquote.
As you might be able to conclude from this, pollination is a pretty important process. In fact, approximately 3 out of 4 of the crop species in the world depend on pollination, at least partly. You can imagine that this plays an important role when it comes to food security and preventing hunger.
And coffee is one of these crops, so pollinators help me get through university. Also, many fruits, vegetables, and nuts are dependent on pollinators, so without them, our meals would look pretty different.
The thing is, not all pollinators like all plants, so you need to have multiple species. Actually, not all pollinators are insects like bees or wasps, but also birds and bats pollinate.
And when it comes to honeybees, some studies have actually shown that when you introduce them to an area, it has negative effects on wild pollinators. Still, honeybees pollinate a lot of crops too, so it's pretty hard to classify them as good or bad. I personally avoid honey nowadays, but you guys are free to disagree.
Of course, the pollinator decline is not just about food production, because many wild plants are dependent on them too. And if the plants suffer, the animals that eat them suffer too. So the impact of a small bug goes a long way.
This is why they are classified as so-called keystone species, which means that they have way more impact than you would expect based on how many of them there are. They are also umbrella species, which means that when you protect them, you kind of accidentally protect other species too.
Anyway, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations identifies some reasons for the pollinator crisis. Many of these are related to agriculture.
Let's start with monocropping. This means you only cultivate one plant in an area. As we said earlier, not all pollinators like the same plants, so it makes sense that growing only one crop does not support very many pollinators.
Then there are pesticides that are toxic substances sprayed to the fields. Now you can imagine if you're using something that is supposed to kill the unwanted insects, it can very well kill the pollinators too.
And climate change can kill many pollinators that do not like hot temperatures. Then there are issues like diseases and alien species, which are species brought by humans from somewhere else.
Or by UFOs to Earth. Those can be pretty bad for pollinators too.
So is there anything we can do about this?
Yes, there is. Maybe if you have a garden or even a balcony, you can plant some flowers that are preferably native to your area. Or you can just put a pot next to your door. Even better if you have several flowers that bloom at different times of the year so that they are feeding opportunities for different seasons. Also, think carefully about the pesticides you use in your garden and ask yourself if they're really needed.
If you're a farmer, there are other things you can do, like grow more diverse crops and use more natural pest control methods than chemicals. But we are not going into that because we assume that most of you are not farmers.
Anyway, the message of the day is be nice to your pollinators. And let's please talk about polar bears now. So one of our lovely friends asked us if polar bears can survive the melting of ice and heat.
Okay, first, it is essential to know that polar bears are highly dependent on sea ice, which makes them extremely vulnerable for climate change. They rely on the sea ice environment for traveling, hunting, mating, resting, and in some areas for maternal dance.
So to answer the question, no, definitely not. Polar bears are adapted to survive in extreme cold weather. Not even for a day can they survive in warm weather. And if they are bred in warm habitats, then they will most probably die in minutes.
Moving on to the whales. Our global ecosystem is such a wonderful and complex thing, where living and non-living things are connected in ways that you might not expect. We wanted to illustrate this with an example, where the decrease in the number of whales would cause a decrease in the amount of carbon dioxide that the ocean could take up from the atmosphere. So basically, it makes sense to protect whales from the perspective of mitigating climate change as well.
Well. Let's talk about how that works then.
If we lose all of our friends after this episode comes out, it is because of these bad animal puns, for sure.
For sure. So basically, there are these teeny tiny organisms in the ocean that we call phytoplanktons. Many of them are very small plants consisting of only one cell. Some of them are algae and some are bacteria. They are the guys responsible for photosynthesis in the ocean. So they turn sunlight and carbon dioxide to oxygen and carbohydrates. They live near the surface because they obviously want to be where the sunlight is.
These little guys need some nutrients to do their thing. So if there is no nutrients, there is no photosynthesis. When the phytoplankton gets eaten by some other organism, like zooplankton, which is a plankton that does not do photosynthesis, the nutrients are, of course, transported to that organism. Then the nutrients will finally sink to the bottom due to these organisms dying, or when these organisms excrete their waste, which is just a fancy way of saying they poop.
Now that the nutrients are on the bottom of the sea, the phytoplankton has a problem. Where are you going to get the nutrients from in the middle of the ocean?
Well, actually, there are some other ways too, but
Shh, don't ruin this, please.
anyway, this is where the whales step in, or rather swim in.
These whales often feed on the bottom as they eat these weird animals that you find down there. Then they usually go chill and poo on the shallower waters, and this is how the nutrients are transported upwards. And the phytoplanktons are happy again.
In summary, phytoplankton uses nutrients from the shallow water. Other creatures eat phytoplanktons. Nutrients fall to the bottom with the corpses or the feces of these creatures. Then whales go eat their meals on the bottom of the sea and get some nutrients from there. And then they poo somewhere higher up, or at least their feces spread to shallower water. And ta-da! The phytoplanktons can get their nutrients again. Now the phytoplankton can keep doing their photosynthesis thing and take some CO2 away from the atmosphere, and that is great for the planet.
There are other ways that whales store carbon dioxide too. For example, whales eat quite some stuff during their lives, and their food contains organic matter, which consists of carbon. When whales die, they sink to the bottom of the sea, and that carbon is stored there on the sea bottom. We have found some estimations that one whale could be worth 1,000 trees. Some sources even say thousands. but we cannot find any concrete numbers for that.
Alright, this was everything that we had to say about bees, polar bears, and whales. This was a bit of a shorter episode, which is probably nice for a change. We hope you enjoyed hanging out with us.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to us today. We really appreciate it. We hope you join us next time too. Please stay tuned for future episodes, especially the next episode when we talk about equality and climate change. So we move on from animals to humans.
Also, if you guys have something that you would like us to talk about, or maybe you have an idea for a fun segment for us, please contact us. We would love to hear from you. You can do that on our personal Instagrams if that is where you found this podcast, but you can also do that on email 4600podcast@gmail.com. Bye!
Bye!